My name is Sophia Bennett. I'm 32, a graphic designer living in Denver, Colorado. And this morning, before the sun had fully settled into the sky, I picked up my phone and counted 29 missed calls from an Illinois number. My coffee sat untouched and went completely cold while I stared at that screen. Because before I pressed play on a single voicemail, some quiet, knowing part of me had already figured out who was on the other end. Certain memories don't soften with the years. They don't disappear. They fold themselves into the corners of your life and wait, patient, unhurried, until one perfectly unremarkable morning pulls them wide open again. For me, all it took was a number, a screen, and 20 years of silence shattering at once. Suddenly, I was 12 years old again, frozen inside Chicago's Union Station, watching the two people whose entire job was to keep me safe turn my terror into a game they had placed bets on. My mother left me there on purpose. As a joke. They actually wagered money on whether a child could navigate a city she had never been alone in. I still carry the feeling of that moment in my body. The hollow drop in my stomach the instant I understood they were not coming back. Every stranger's face became a wall. The noise of the station pressed in from all sides. The whole city felt vast and merciless around a little girl with barely any cash and no idea where to go. That afternoon sliced my life cleanly in two, the version of me that existed before it, and the person I had no choice but to build afterward. I never went back. Not that week, not that year, not ever. I constructed a new life, a new name, and a future so deliberately removed from them that most mornings I could almost convince myself they had simply ceased to exist. But 29 missed calls from Illinois proved something I had spent 2 decades trying to bury alive. The past does not honor your boundaries. When it wants you, it comes. Growing up in Willow Creek, Illinois, I learned something early and I learned it well. Appearances are everything. From the outside, we looked like the definition of respectable. The kind of family people pointed to approvingly, solid, hardworking, decent. My parents ran a modest, but profitable chain of home goods stores. The sort of places that sold everything from blenders to discount bedding. The kind of shop where you wandered in for one thing and left with 6. On weekends, my father grilled in the backyard. My mother waved cheerfully at neighbors over the fence. To everyone watching, we were the picture of the American ideal. Inside that house, love was a prize you had to earn, and safety was something you calculated daily based on my mother's mood. She adored the word lesson. Every stumble I made became raw material. If I got emotional, I was oversensitive. If I asked for support, I was helpless. If I forgot something, I needed to develop responsibility. She could transform any ordinary childhood mistake into an opportunity to make me feel small. My father participated with a kind of enthusiastic glee, as though cruelty were a sport they were both training for together. When I was 8, my shoes had started to fall apart, and I asked for a new pair at the mall. My mother announced I was acting spoiled, walked me to a bench near the food court, and declared that if I thought the world owed me something, I should sit right there alone and find out otherwise. They disappeared for nearly 3 hours. I sat watching people buy soft pretzels, breathing in cinnamon, forcing myself not to cry because crying seemed to please them. When they finally returned, my father teased my mother about whether she owed him $20. He had gambled on the exact spot I would still be sitting. When I was 10, I got upset after a youth football game because older boys from school had mocked me in the parking lot. Rather than comfort me, my parents drove to the deserted far end of the stadium lot, told me to get out, and drove away as the sun dropped below the horizon. I sat curled on a concrete curb, watching the lot empty out one vehicle at a time. They came back nearly an hour later with fast food for themselves, and not a single word of apology for me. My father found the whole thing wildly funny. He said he had been betting on whether I would beg strangers for a ride. That was the pattern. Everything became a test. Everything became a punchline at my expense. Everything was framed as preparation, as if the world were so hard that they needed to manufacture extra hardness on top of it. The strangest piece of the puzzle was that they genuinely did not see themselves as cruel. They spoke about grit, character, and real-world readiness. They dressed ugly things in respectable language. Ask them, and they would have told you they were raising a fiercely self-reliant daughter. But self-reliance was not what they were building. They were building fear. They were building a child who scanned every room for exits, who made herself invisible to stay safe, who learned that silence and usefulness and smallness were the only reliable forms of protection. The one place I ever felt fully like myself was on paper. I drew everywhere, on the backs of receipts, in textbook margins, on cheap pads I bought with babysitting money. I drew rooms with locking doors. I drew train windows flooding with yellow light. I drew women standing alone on mountain ridges with nothing behind them. At 12, I couldn't have explained what any of that meant. Now I understand perfectly. I was drawing my way out of my own life. What finally broke everything open was something absurdly small, the kind of thing most parents would forget within the week. I brought home a B+ in art class. Not history, not math. Art, the one subject that made me feel like I belonged somewhere. I was proud of it until I walked through the front door and saw my mother holding the report card like it was proof of something shameful. She wanted to know how a girl who drew constantly could still manage to disappoint her in the class that was supposedly her strength. My father suggested I must be getting lazy. My mother suggested I had started confusing effort with actual achievement. That night I sat in my room pretending to study while their voices drifted from the kitchen, low and entertained. My mother said I needed a lesson that would stick with me permanently. My father said he would bet on it. The next morning they were almost suspiciously cheerful. My mother made pancakes. My father asked if I wanted orange juice. They told me we were taking a day trip into Chicago, just the three of us. For one foolish, desperate second, I let myself believe they were trying to reset things. Maybe the tension from the report card was over. Maybe this was the closest our family ever got to an apology. I should have recognized the warning signs. The whole drive from Willow Creek to the city felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite name. My father had the radio turned up loud and drummed the steering wheel like a man who had already won. My mother kept rotating in the passenger seat to lob questions at me, questions designed to have no safe answer. Did I consider myself smart? Did I think smart girls were prepared for real life? Did I think life would be patient with fear? Every careful answer I gave seemed to amuse them. Every silence I tried to take refuge in. They broke with another question. By the time Chicago's skyline materialized through the windshield, that familiar dread had settled deep in my chest. Something was coming, and I would not be allowed to brace for it. We parked near Union Station around noon. I had never seen anything so enormous or so alive with strangers. The building felt like its own compressed city. Business people with rolling luggage, tourists studying maps, families, college students, all of them moving with the certainty of people who knew exactly where they belonged. I stayed close to my parents because I didn't know where else to stand. Inside the main hall, my mother pointed to a pillar near the entrance and told me to wait there while they moved the car and picked up lunch. 15 minutes, she said. Maybe 20. I asked if I could come along. My father laughed so loudly that heads turned. He said I was 12, not 2. My mother told me not to embarrass her in public. So I nodded and stayed. I watched the clock. 15 minutes passed. Then 30, then 45. I told myself the parking was difficult. The line for food was long. They had gotten turned around. After an hour, my chest started to tighten. After an hour and a half, panic was moving up through my body fast enough to make my hands tremble. I had $9. No phone. No address written anywhere. No understanding of how trains worked. I had never felt so irrelevant to my own existence. I crept a few feet from the pillar, then rushed back, then crept out again, still terrified of doing the one thing they told me not to do. Some part of me was still more afraid of their anger than of being lost. The station grew louder as the afternoon wore on. Every announcement from the overhead speakers made me flinch. Every dark-haired woman made me spin around. Then I spotted our car through the front windows, gliding slowly past on the street outside. My entire body surged with relief so overwhelming it almost made me laugh. I sprinted toward the glass waving both arms and actually believed, for one unbearable second, that they had come back for me. My father was driving. My mother was in the passenger seat. They were both looking straight at me. My father smiled first. Not the relieved, tearful smile of a parent who has just found a frightened child. The smile of a man watching the exact punchline he engineered land right on time. My mother lowered her window just enough for her voice to carry over the traffic. She called out, "I bet $50 you can't even find your way home." Then she laughed. My father laughed with her and raised one hand off the steering wheel in a small, satisfied thumbs up. Then the car rolled forward and vanished into traffic. That was the moment the shape of the world changed for me permanently. Fearing they might forget me was one thing. Suspecting they were running another experiment was one thing. Watching them consciously choose it, Watching them enjoy it was something entirely different. My fear was not incidental to what they were doing. My fear was the product they were after. A stranger brushed past me and muttered, "Excuse me," and the sound of another human voice snapped me back into my body. I stumbled back inside because I had nowhere else to go. I drifted from one end of the station to the other, crying quietly and wiping my face every few minutes, ashamed to be seen upset, because they had trained that reflex into me, too. I ran through every person I might call. There was no one. I tried to reconstruct a mental map home. Home might as well have been another country. I sat on benches. I walked in wide circles until my legs ached. At some point I stopped expecting them. At some point waiting became abandonment. Those may sound like the same thing, but when you are 12 years old, the difference between them feels like falling through ice in slow motion. Nearly 3 hours passed inside that station. Long enough for the afternoon light to begin shifting. Long enough for the crowds to cycle through. Long enough that I stopped thinking in full sentences and started operating purely on instinct. I stayed away from the exits because stepping into the city terrified me. I stayed away from police officers because my parents had always warned me that involving authority would only make everything worse. I stayed away from strangers because the same people who had just abandoned me had spent years drilling into me that asking for help was weakness. That was perhaps the most deliberate cruelty embedded in the whole thing. They had specifically dismantled every tool that could have helped me quickly, then placed me in the one situation where those tools were the only way out. The person who finally reached me was a station employee named Maria. She was in her 50s, with the kind of measured calm that makes you want to tell the truth even when you're scared. She'd apparently noticed me circling the same stretch of seats and vending machines several times. She stopped me near a hallway leading toward the administrative area and asked if I was lost. I lied without hesitation. I said I was waiting for my parents. She asked how long. I said I wasn't sure. She asked whether I had eaten anything. That question was the one that collapsed everything I had been holding together. I started crying so hard I could barely draw breath. All the shame I had been swallowing since noon came apart at once, ugly and loud and completely beyond my control. I told her they had left me. I told her they had driven past the window and laughed. Reached by phone, I could only hear one side of the call, but I watched the officer's expression move from careful professionalism to open disbelief in roughly 10 seconds. He asked whether they were returning to Chicago immediately. A long pause. Then he said, plainly, "No, ma'am." Leaving a 12-year-old child in a major transit station is not a lesson in independence. It is child abandonment. Every cell in my body went cold, not because the words sounded too harsh, because they fit. By early evening, I was sitting in a small administrative room with a social worker who explained that because my parents were refusing to come back and were still characterizing this as a parenting decision, I could not simply be returned home. Even if they changed their minds, there would be an emergency placement while the court reviewed the case. I didn't follow most of the legal language, but I understood the look on her face perfectly. She believed me. More than that, she believed I had not been safe long before that afternoon. The idea of going to a foster home terrified me. I had grown up hearing stories about what happened to children taken away from their families. But then I met Mark and Laura Bennett. They weren't trying too hard, weren't performing warmth for effect. He was a photographer with perpetual ink stains on his hands from handling prints. She was a preschool teacher who smelled faintly of lotion and classroom paper. Their house was warm and comfortably disordered in a way that felt inhabited rather than chaotic. A lamp burning in the entryway, family photos tacked to the wall, a dog bed in the corner even though the dog itself was somewhere in the back of the house. Presumably asleep, Laura asked whether I preferred spaghetti or soup. Mark asked whether I liked the hall light left on overnight. Nobody reacted when I said I didn't know the answer to either. Nobody laughed when I started crying at the dinner table after 2 bites, because exhaustion had finally outrun pretending. That first night, I barely slept. Every car door on the street made me bolt upright. Every creak in the hallway kept me rigid. But one thought circled through all of it. A woman I'd met 90 minutes ago at a train station had given me more sincere kindness than my own mother had offered in years. I didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. I only knew the world looked fundamentally different than it had that morning. And once you understand that other people are genuinely capable of protecting you, it becomes impossible to keep calling the other thing normal. The days following felt like living inside someone else's script. From the Bennett's house, I went to social worker meetings, to psychological evaluations, to a family court building downtown where adults spoke with careful gravity about my future as though it were both urgent and fragile at once. My parents arrived with a lawyer and carried themselves exactly as they always had at home, relaxed, mildly offended, faintly amused that anyone was making this large a deal. My mother wore a navy blazer and pearl earrings as though looking composed would cancel out what she had done. My father sat with his arms crossed and his chair tilted back, radiating the patience of a man certain this was a temporary inconvenience. They did not deny leaving me at Union Station. That was the staggering part. They admitted it outright. They simply insisted it had been measured, purposeful, and educational. My mother told the court she had been cultivating resilience. My father said American children had been made too fragile and someone had to teach them how actual life operated. I sat across the table listening to this and understood something that altered me almost as completely as the station itself. They would never become the kind of people capable of seeing what they had actually done. If that ability had existed anywhere inside them, they would have turned the car around before they reached the expressway. The court-appointed therapist's report used the following phrases: emotional abuse, systematic humiliation, neglect, and escalating endangerment. Those words were not mine, but hearing them read aloud was like oxygen flooding a sealed room. For years, I had quietly believed my childhood was somehow my fault, that explanation was simpler than believing the people responsible for me were causing harm on purpose. The report made it plain. This had not been a misunderstanding, not a strict but loving parenting philosophy. It had been abuse wrapped in middle-class language. When the judge asked whether I wished to return home under court supervision, I said no before he had finished the sentence. My mother stared at me as if I had struck her. My father muttered something about ingratitude under his breath. The judge didn't flinch. The phase that followed was supposed to be a structured path toward reunification, parenting courses, family therapy, supervised contact, regular reviews. My parents treated it like a public humiliation rather than an opportunity. They resented being assessed. They resented oversight. They hated that teachers, therapists, and court officers could now access the private interior of the family they had spent years carefully presenting to the outside world. My father complained far more about damage to the store's reputation than about losing custody of his daughter. My mother insisted repeatedly that no government body had the right to dictate how she raised her own child. Then came the moment that crystallized everything. They were given a clear choice: commit fully to a 2-year reunification process, or voluntarily terminate their parental rights. They chose to terminate, without hesitation. My chest did not break the way you might expect. It went very still. I had spent my entire childhood trying to be good enough to avoid being discarded. In the end, they discarded me rather than admit they had ever been wrong. That truth is the one that has taken the longest to fully metabolize. They were not taken from me by an overreaching system. They handed me over to preserve their pride. After that, things moved more quickly. The Bennetts were already licensed foster parents, and over the following months, they became something else entirely. Mark began setting aside photography books and art magazines because he had noticed how constantly I drew. Laura knocked before entering my room, a gesture so small it seems almost absurd to mention, until you grow up in a house where your door is never truly yours. They learned which foods made me anxious because of old punishments tied to meals. They stopped demanding eye contact when I was distressed. They did not extract love or gratitude or performed happiness from me. They simply stayed. Steadiness is almost supernatural to a child who has never had access to it. The adoption was finalized after the required amount of time had elapsed, but emotionally, it had already happened long before any judge signed anything. When I was asked if I wanted to change my name, I said yes immediately. Jennifer Caldwell belonged to a girl who had stood beside a station pillar with $9 and no idea whether she would survive her own family's judgment by nightfall. Sophia Bennett was someone else. Someone with a room of her own, a desk covered in drawing supplies, and people who didn't find her fear entertaining. I still remember the first evening after the adoption was official. Laura put fresh sheets on the bed the way she did every Sunday. Mark placed a new sketchbook on my desk. Nobody made a speech. Nobody told me to feel grateful or lucky or healed. They acted as though I had simply been theirs all along. That quiet, unremarkable certainty repaired more inside me than any dramatic gesture ever could. It taught taught me that real love does not issue tests before granting you the right to stay. Real love makes room for you before you know how to settle into it. Healing did not arrive in one clean wave, and it did not travel in a straight line. People want stories where a single act of rescue rewrites everything, where the wounded child blooms the instant she is placed in safer hands. That was not my story. For years, my body still interpreted kindness as a possible setup. If Laura said she'd be back in 15 minutes after running an errand, I had to consciously resist stationing myself at the window to wait. If Mark was late picking me up because of traffic, I could feel panic assembling itself in my chest so fast my hands went numb. I hated public waiting. I hated being told to stay put. I hated the phrase, "I'll be right back." Therapy helped, but it was slow and demanding work, the kind that makes you say difficult truths aloud, repeatedly, until your nervous system gradually agrees with what your mind already knows. I learned the words trauma, emotional abuse, hypervigilance. I learned that sustained harm does not build strength the way cruel people claim it does. It makes you extraordinarily skilled at surviving danger and deeply unpracticed at resting. The Bennetts never rushed any of it. They showed up to school events, remembered my specific triggers, helped with coursework, and let me keep my door closed whenever I needed the boundary. They didn't try to sand away what had happened. They helped me construct a life in which it was no longer the only thing that defined me. Art became more than an escape route. It became a language, a structure, proof that I could create something worth looking at without anyone's permission or approval. I channeled everything into it through high school, then into college applications, then into every portfolio review and late studio session after I was accepted to the Art Institute of Chicago. Returning to the city that had once swallowed me felt purely practical at first. The program was right. The school was strong. But somewhere in those years, I realized what I was quietly reclaiming. The same city where I had once been abandoned became the place where I assembled myself from scratch. After graduation, I accepted a position in Denver with a branding firm that worked primarily with small businesses. For the first time, I lived far enough from Illinois that the geography itself felt like an act of self-protection. Denver gave me breathing room, new neighborhoods, new rhythms, air dry enough to clear my head on difficult mornings. Eventually, I began freelancing on evenings and weekends, then opened my own studio. I built a reputation around clean visual communication, the kind of work that helps people express clearly who they are and what they believe. The irony was not lost on me. My entire career grew from the fact that I had spent a childhood buried inside other people's deliberate dishonesty. I met Alex at a friend's housewarming party. He was a software engineer, patient in a way that never felt rehearsed, and very difficult to destabilize. On our third date, I mentioned my family history was complicated. On our fifth, I offered a little more detail. Months later, when I finally told him the full story of Union Station, he didn't interrupt, didn't over-emote, didn't reach for some tired line about how everything happens to make us stronger. He reached across the table, took my hand, and said, "That should never have happened to you." The simplicity of it almost undid me completely. We built our life together the way I had rebuilt myself, deliberately, with plenty of space for honesty. We married in a small ceremony with Mark walking me down the aisle and Laura standing behind me fixing my dress, while quietly crying. We adopted a rescue dog named Max, a scruffy mixed breed with one torn ear and the watchful, careful soul of something else that had been abandoned too early. I blocked every account my biological parents ever used to attempt contact: Facebook, Instagram, old email addresses. One phone number change after a holiday voicemail from an Illinois area code left me shaking for an hour. I didn't speak of them unless I had no choice. I didn't visit Willow Creek. I didn't use my old name. Most weeks I could go entire stretches without Jennifer Caldwell surfacing at all. That was the life I had built by the time the missed calls arrived. A marriage I trusted, a studio with steady clients, morning walks with Max, dinners with close friends, Sunday phone calls with Mark and Laura. A life so quiet and whole that sometimes I'd wonder whether peace always felt a little strange to people who had grown up fighting for every inch of it. Then my phone lit up with 29 missed calls from Illinois, and the floor under that life shifted without warning. There was a voicemail, then an email from an address I didn't recognize, then a message request on LinkedIn, the one platform I'd kept public for professional reasons. That detail told me this had required deliberate effort. Someone had been searching. Someone had finally connected the name Sophia Bennett to the girl they had once laughed laughed at through a car window. I sat at my kitchen counter while Max pressed his weight against my leg and Alex watched the color drain from my face. I had spent 20 years making sure that past stayed buried. Whatever was moving now had unearthed it with both hands. The voicemail was not from my mother. It was from my younger sister, Hannah, a voice I hadn't heard since she was a small girl trailing me through the hallway in mismatched socks, too young to understand why the air in our house always felt pressurized. Her voice had aged. It carried the rough texture of a life that had pressed hard on it. She told me our mother had been diagnosed with late-stage cancer. Our father had suffered a mild stroke 6 months earlier. The stores were gone, not struggling, gone. Closed or sold at significant losses one by one, after a story I had assumed was sealed in old court records had resurfaced in the worst possible way. A relative had posted about the Union Station incident on a local Facebook group after my mother, in a move of jaw-dropping hypocrisy, left a comment on a stranger's parenting post about how today's children needed firmer discipline. That one comment opened a door that would not close again. Former neighbors started sharing what they remembered. A retired court clerk who probably should have kept her professional distance didn't. Someone tracked down a newspaper item about a custody matter involving an abandoned minor. A former store employee added what she had witnessed behind closed doors. The image my parents had invested decades constructing came apart in public quickly and irreparably. Customers stopped returning. People drove to the chain stores in neighboring towns rather than spend another dollar there. Church friends went silent. Civic groups stopped returning calls. Willow Creek, which had once wrapped them in the comfortable insulation of small-town reputation, turned on them with those same tools. Hannah told me they were living in a subsidized apartment on the edge of town now. No house, no stores, no standing, no version of the old family left to shelter inside. And then she told me the line that explained exactly why there had been 29 missed calls rather than one measured message. They wanted me to come back. Not because they had transformed into different people. Not because time had finally given them the honesty to face what they had done. But because they had exhausted every other option and were frightened of dying without anyone beside them. I asked Hannah why she was calling if she understood I had every reason not to pick up. There was a long pause. Then she said, "Because I wanted you to hear it from someone who isn't lying to you." She had cut contact with them too, not years ago, but recently, after becoming a mother herself and requesting copies of the original court records to understand what had actually happened when I left. Our parents had spent years feeding her a simplified version. I had overreacted. The state had overstepped. The foster family had manipulated an impressionable child. Hannah said reading the actual documentation felt like being struck by something moving very fast. She looked at her own son afterward and understood she could never allow those people anywhere near him. That should have felt like vindication. Instead, it made me tired in a place deeper than anger ever reaches. She asked whether I would come. I said I would think about it. Alex told me I owed them absolutely nothing. Laura said that whatever I chose, it needed to serve my peace, not their comfort. Mark said quietly that some people only start looking for the bridge after they've already set the house on fire. I sat with all of it through the night. By morning, one thing had crystallized clearly. I was not going back to rescue them. I was going back to finish it on my own terms. I flew into Chicago 2 days later and drove the remaining distance to the hospital where my mother was receiving treatment. The room smelled of antiseptic and stale fear. My father looked older than I had pictured, diminished, too, as though illness and public disgrace had finally stripped away the performance and left only the ordinary frightened man beneath it. My mother still had that instinctively composed expression, even from a hospital bed, as though dignity were something she could maintain through sheer force of habit. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then my mother began crying before I had even sat down, not a quiet, private cry, but the kind constructed to pull the room's attention immediately. She said my name, my old name. I corrected her once, and only once. Sophia. She nodded, dabbing at her face. My father said they had made mistakes. Mistakes. The word people reach for when the accurate word is too heavy to carry. I told them no. Missing an exit is a mistake. Forgetting an item at the grocery store is a mistake. Driving a 12-year-old to an unfamiliar city, leaving her alone in a crowded transit station, watching her panic through the window of a moving car and laughing. That is not a mistake. That is a deliberate choice made by people who understood exactly what they were doing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. My father began to speak, likely reaching for another framing, a softer word, a more palatable explanation. I told him I hadn't traveled to Illinois to receive a revised version of something I had already lived. I told them what they had created. A child whose terror was the entertainment. A family whose reputation had finally caught up to the reality behind it. Two people sitting in a hospital room without a business, without community standing, and without either daughter willing to be in the same room with them voluntarily. My mother asked whether I could forgive them. I told her forgiveness was not a debt I carried toward people who had only come looking for me once their lives had collapsed and left them with no remaining options. And then I said the sentence that had been forming inside me, in different shapes and different languages. Since I was 12 years old standing beside a pillar with $9. You bet on whether I could find my way home. I did. I just didn't come back to yours. They both cried then. For once their tears had no effect on me, not because I had become hard, but because the grief was for themselves, and I was no longer responsible for carrying it. I wasn't cruel. I didn't shout or insult them. That was the piece that surprised me most. When it finally arrived, the thing I had spent years imagining as revenge was not loud at all. It was quiet. It was precise. It was done. I told them I would not be managing their finances, coordinating their medical care, or reinstating contact. I told them Hannah had every right to protect her child. I told them my family was in Colorado and in Illinois with the people who had genuinely earned that word. Then I stood up. My father asked whether this was truly goodbye. I looked at him and said it had been goodbye for 20 years. They were simply the last people to understand that. I walked out after 20 minutes and did not look back. In the hospital parking lot, the air felt sharp and unusually bright. I stood there with both hands trembling, not from regret, but from the strange physical release of something that has haunted you finally taking on a shape you can leave behind. On the flight home, I thought about the girl at Union Station, the one who had believed being abandoned meant being permanently unworthy of belonging anywhere. She had been wrong. She was unwanted by two people who had confused cruelty with strength, but she was not unworthy of love. Those are not the same thing. Understanding the difference is what saved my life. If there is anything worth passing on from all of this, it is this. Abuse does not become discipline because a parent selects more dignified vocabulary for it. Humiliation does not shape character. Fear does not toughen children. It ages them before their time and teaches them to survive rather than to live. And choosing to walk away from people who have repeatedly harmed you, regardless of what blood you share, is not bitterness or selfishness. Sometimes it is the most honest, courageous, self-respecting decision you will ever make. I did not leave that hospital room carrying guilt. I left it carrying clarity, the kind you can only earn through your own survival. The family you are born into has the power to shape your wounds. It does not have the power to determine your future. Real love does not laugh at your fear. A real family does not engineer tests to confirm whether you're worth keeping. Real healing begins the moment you stop calling cruelty a lesson and start calling it what it was, and once you do that, once you say it plainly and let it land, you discover you are capable of building a life so grounded, so honest, so full of genuine peace, that even the people who once tried to break you cannot reach it anymore.